Welcome everybody to the Indie Scientology podcast. I'm your host Andy Nolch, and it's nice to be here listening to Strauss. This is a podcast that has to do with Scientology. The world's newest and most interesting religion. In fact, it's such an interesting religion that it might not even be defined as a religion. Imagine if someone invented a burger that was such a new burger that it's almost not even in the category of being a burger. That's what I'm talking about. If you like this episode, then make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And go to Andy Nolch's YouTube channel and subscribe to that. That's where I make videos about Scientology, and that's where these podcast episodes are uploaded, as well as iTunes. If you have no idea what Scientology is, then listen to the first few episodes of this podcast, because they'll answer some basic questions about Scientology, because it can be quite a complex subject. Oh! Hear that? It's now time. We're going down the rabbit hole into that world of Scientology. Up is down, down is up, left is right, right is left. What? Whoa. We're here. What you thought isn't possible is possible. Welcome to the Indie Scientology podcast. I'm your host, Andy Nolch, and today's show is a guest interview with Peter Moon, the time travel Montauk author. He's an extremely interesting person, and he's also he did Scientology, but I don't think he would call himself a Scientologist today. And that's one of the questions I asked him. I asked him during the interview. But before that, I just want to say a big celebration on the 10th episode of the podcast. Yes, 10 episodes in. Things are looking great. It's the viewership is in an affluence trend. I'm not just saying that. I'm not reporting false statistics like certain people do in the Scientology world. No, it genuinely is in affluence, and it's great, and it's going good. Got some good interviews, and it's going to get better and better. There's many interesting people. There's many juicy questions to be asked to those people to interview about Scientology, and they'll be coming up in the future. This is pretty much a hobby, but more like a serious hobby for me. It's a unique sort of niche market. I don't expect to make any money from this ever. Like pretty far in the future, maybe. And I'm talking like 10, 20 years. But in the short term, no. This is for indie Scientologists and church members or anyone who is interested and wanting to find out about Scientology. And it's a, because it's such a niche and unique topic, obviously I'm cutting out a lot of the general audience. If it was a podcast about babies laughing or something, I'll get it's a lot more of a chance of making money. But this isn't a making money venture or anything. But anyway, it's great to make it 10 episodes in, and it's just gonna get better and better. Now, in Scientology news, Tom Cruise's mother, Mary Lee South, has passed away at age 80. A memorial service over the weekend was held at a local church of Scientology, and I don't know where that is, but I don't know, maybe it was at the Celebrity Center. But anyway, that's sad news, but it's good news that she made it to age 80, because I feel like, it's too early if you pass away before the age of 70. Auckland Ideal.org did open up almost a month ago now, but if you want to see some pictures of it, go to the the official church website. I think it's Scientology.org, and look up Auckland Ideal.org, and there's pics of it. It looks very nice. Um, I tried to see if there was a video of the event, because usually there's the promotional video that church makes, showing the opening of the building and everything. But yeah, there's pics there you can see, and there's writing there about the opening. It's pretty good, and good on them. We'll reform those buggers. All right, here's a win of the week, and this is on Solo Knots. The auditing continues to go very well. I got a wild story for you. Wednesday, I'm in session at the usual time, poking around for something to run. Attention goes to my brother Dave, and there I perceived Knott's case in his space. The thing is, Dave's out for a bike ride. Bang, 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 bang. My needle is diving off the pin. TA going nuts. Charge blowing off like dandelion seeds in a gust of wind. Later that day, Dave's comm goes way up. Next day, he comes downstairs with his eyes bugging out of his head. He had just received an out-of-nowhere call from his ex-wife. They'd been out of comm for a long time, ARC break of long duration. They'd had a long conversation, and a big piece of some nasty thing had just gone poof for him. He's blown out and in an obvious state of release from whatever it was. The way he characterized it, it was magical. He then starts originating on forgiveness and honesty and clean hands making a happy life. I've never heard originations like this from him. He just doesn't originate much normally. He's more VGIs than I've ever seen him. His face has smoothed out. Magic all right. And I don't know who that was, but yeah, that seems like a win of the week. Okay, here is an LRH quote, and this is a good one. All right, you ready? This is a really good one. This is from Scientology: A New Slant on Life. Definitely one of my favorite Scientology books, and it's fantastic for people who are new to Scientology. So if you're new to this podcast and you've no idea what Scientology is, just get your hands on A New Slant on Life, and it will read it, and it will give you a new slant on life. You start thinking differently and approaching everything differently. Anyway, this quote is, "All the happiness you ever find lies in you." Oh, isn't that interesting? Yeah. It's up to you. Now you reap what you sow. Okay, now it's time for the guest interview with Peter Moon, and I spoke with Peter probably about a week ago now, and he's a very interesting fellow. He was a Scientologist, and I think he got up to OT3 in the 70s, and he was on the ship, and he worked close to LRH, and when he left Scientology in about 83, like many other sires left, he 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 went down the rabbit hole in life, and this interview I could have spoke about what he's doing nowadays and more about this time travel stuff that he's looking into, but we kept it more to Scientology because there's many interviews I guess you can find on the internet of him talking about Romania and time travel and these very interesting things like the Montauk Project. But this podcast and this interview is more to do with Scientology. But what was great was that he had a lot of very, very interesting things to say. And look, I'll be honest, when I first heard some of his stuff where he's talking about time travel and this Montauk is basically a secret underground government facility where mind control and time travel occurs in near New York. It seems pretty out there and unbelievable, but I've heard a lot of evidence that these underground bases exist throughout the whole world, and this sort of stuff goes on in those bases. Anyway, I kind of thought that he might be a disinformation agent, to be honest, when I first came across some of his stuff, because I'm into Alex Jones and unusual things and conspiracy theories and that, but this guy was really, really out there talking about his time travel and stuff, and I thought he might be a disinformation agent, someone who's just, taking conspiracies too far to discredit the whole conspiracy thing. So the average person just thinks, oh, that's just a time travel nutter that's making it up or whatever. I thought he might be that, but then I listened to more of his stuff, and he makes sense. And apparently his Montauk book, all his books are apparently good, but the first book he wrote in 1992 is good, or he published or sort of co-wrote. But the more I looked into him, the more I thought, oh, no, this guy's legit. He's not a disinformation agent. And this interview reconfirmed that in me, because I know what he's talking about, and you who's listening, who's a Scientologist, will know what he's talking about. And he might mention some things, like he mentioned what he in the interview he mentions what he thinks about Captain Bill, and that's sort of more personal opinion sort of thing, and I sort of disagree with that. But all the other things in the interview, and facts and times and dates, because he's quite specific in like Scientology history and stuff, they're correct. So he's not just someone making things up. So it's good. It's good that he's not a disinformation agent, basically, is what I'm saying. And he's got a very interesting perspective on Scientology and had an interesting experience with it. And I specifically asked him during the interview, so you're saying that time travel exists and that people are using it on Earth right now? And he says, yes, I'm pretty sure. Or he says, time travel is definitely possible or something. And that's very interesting, because it's so down the rabbit hole, time travel, and this podcast is down the rabbit hole, and Scientology is down the rabbit hole, and let's say Alex Jones conspiracies, they are down the rabbit hole, but time travel and Mandela effect and some of these, they're really down the rabbit hole. You know what I mean? Like, time travel is really down the rabbit hole, because it's like, what the hell? It's like alternate realities and multiple timelines, and it's so down the rabbit hole. It's just incredible to comprehend, and it's like, it's amazing to think that this time travel stuff could be true. It's just, I can't understand it, and it's so out there. But we do talk, I think, more in the second half a bit about topics that don't have to do with Scientology. So I guess you could skip the first hour if you don't want to hear about Scientology stuff. But everything, he's such an interesting person, Peter Moon. Everything we talk about, we go off topics a little bit, and we it's all relevant. I'd recommend listening to all of it. But let's now go to the interview with Peter Moon. Born and raised in California, Peter Moon is primarily known for his investigation of space-time projects. These concern projects in the past, present, and future that control both time and perception of time. An avid reader as a young man, he studied creative writing and literature, and was particularly interested in both the scientific extrapolations of science fiction as well as the high adventure that it provided. His interest in Eastern religion and Western occultism culminated in a unique career and association that centered around the private concerns of L. Ron Hubbard, a renowned science fiction writer who was an accomplished occultist, but is also known as the controversial founder of Dianetics and Scientology, a person we all know about here on this podcast. Peter went out on his own in 1983 and moved to Long Island, where his unique background enabled him to forge an association with scientist Preston Nichols, one of the world's foremost experts in the world on electromagnetic phenomena, who had also been involved in strange experiments at the Montauk Air Force Station on Long Island, which included the manipulation of time. Their collaboration in writing the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, and its subsequent sequels have now reached legendary proportions. Peter's work caught the attention of time control scientist Dr. David Anderson of the Time Travel Research Center on Long Island, now incorporated as the Anderson Institute in New Mexico, who invited him to Romania and paved the way for him to investigate other space-time projects as discussed in the Transylvania series, one of which includes what has been called the most amazing archaeological artifact in the history of mankind, a chamber that contains a holographic record of Earth's history as well as holographic readouts of human DNA and other species. Peter has just released a new series of videos, Time Travel Theory Explained, which explains in simple language the actual scientific principles demonstrating that time travel is within the boundaries of ordinary mathematics and physics. And I've got him here on the podcast. Are you there, Peter Moon?
I'm there. It's nice to be with you, Andy.
Great. Yes, it's good to have you. So these days you're making these Time Travel Theory Explained videos, is it?
Well, I did those about a year ago, and I'm actually, it's funny today. I have a website, timetraveleducationcenter.com, and I'm writing at least 3 books simultaneously on that website. That is a subscription website. You can watch the videos for free. There's a lot of things you can get for free. Then I also have a paid subscriber so people can read the books and give me feedback. But I just finished chapter 7 of a book that I'm working on currently. It's called L. Ron Hubbard, The Tao of Insanity. And, I don't, the title does not say that he's insane. It might imply it to some. But certainly, one of the things I state in that book, you're asking me what I'm working on. Well, this is what I was working on today. Tomorrow it might be another book. But I just got to the chapter where I quoted from the well-known, infamous, or famous book, whatever you want to call it, L. Ron Hubbard, Madman or Messiah, where he's going into his fascination with the occult. It portrays Hubbard as a literal crazed lunatic who's an occultist. And I know that your audience is primarily independent Scientologists. And this is just what I was working on today. We can go into that if you want. We can go wherever you want, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so I just want to get that. What was that website you mentioned again, where we can see some of this stuff?
TimeTravelEducationCenter.com. TimeTravelEducationCenter.com. One can opt in, put their email in, and obtain 7 videos. Those are just strictly on the math and physics of demonstrating that time travel is within the boundaries of ordinary math and physics. It doesn't need quantum physics or anything like that to establish that. It's very simple.
So basically you're a time travel truther, just to clear this up.
I wouldn't call myself that. I don't like the word truther, but I have been involved with helping. Part of my role here is to help human beings understand time. A lot of what I spent a lot of time as a word clear, just so people that are independents understand my background. In addition, and I think it's important because if your audience is primarily independents or people that have some affiliation with Scientology, I worked, I had wonderful experiences as a pre-clear, went, full body exterior after about a year in Scientology. I soon joined the Sea Org. I worked in many different jobs in the Sea Org, but I spent a lot of time as an auditor. I worked as a cramming officer in qualifications, worked as a qualification secretary, a review chief of international management. I worked in the personal office of L. Ron Hubbard. I was concerned with his primary, with his correspondence and was given a lot of inside information. I signed a 30-year, non-disclosure agreement in 1977, which is, 10 years in the history. I mean, I can say anything I want per that disclosure agreement. Um, so yeah, I've had a lot of experiences. I worked at the top level of Scientology, and knew all of those management secrets. So I have a very unique perspective on the subject, and I'm not. And I should also add that I'm not bitter or critical of L. Ron Hubbard, like a lot of people who worked, in his vicinity.
Yes. Yes. Now, I want to go over your history in Scientology, but before that, can you explain to me a bit more this book that you're writing now? Like, when will it be released, and exactly what it will be about?
Well, the reason I wrote the book, I wrote another book called. I mean, I got all involved when I got out of Scientology. Just to give some background, it was 1983, and I would call, to use Scientology lingo, the basic, the third dynamic. I've got to go back and use this term. The third dynamic engram, as well as the fourth dynamic engram, from a Scientology perspective, kind of keyed in 1981, 82.
Now, hold on. When you're saying that, are you sort of referring to the fact that the humanity screwed up, and that's keying you in? I just want to clear this up a bit.
No, not humanity screwed up. Scientology screwed up. And when I say Scientology, I mean that as an organization.
Okay.
In 1981, the end of 81, there were, well, I don't know if I should go right into this, because this is something that people that were at the top lines of Scientology just didn't understand or didn't get.
No, go into it, because I noticed that a lot of people don't understand the history and what this sort of Scientology civil war that happened in the early 80s.
Well, yes, and I will tell you how it all got started. And it started as a result of actions by L. Ron Hubbard. And I just saw it. It was very clear to me. And part of the reason it was clear to me is I had been briefed upon it. And I was in a position where I could, would, and should be briefed upon it, where the average rank and file Sea Org member wasn't necessarily briefed on the depth of it.
Okay, so what were you exactly briefed on?
Okay, this was a program called de-op, which meant de-oppression. And I should just say, because I mentioned I wrote a book called Montauk Book of the Dead, which goes into my whole history and that's on what do you call it? Not eBay,
Amazon.
Nook, Kindle, yes. I mean, you can get it on ebook form. That was to explain how I got involved, to my regular readership, how I got involved in all of this, which was my Scientology experience. It was not written for Scientologists, although I did make it compatible to them if they wanted to read it. Like, I didn't put any of the OT3 material in there out of respect to people who, shouldn't read it or didn't think they should read it. And of course, OT3 wasn't talked about so much on the internet in the time that I wrote that. But anyway, that's a book that I wrote about my own personal experiences. But De-oppression was a program that was based upon the idea, well, it was based on two ideas. And the pragmatic idea was that the staff had been, I guess, sort of suppressed by internal conditions. They weren't paid enough. They were sort of, what's this, Tale of Two Cities? There was sort of a Dickens paradigm going on. The staff were too poor, scrawny, raunchy, and those words weren't used, but that's essentially what it is. They were have-nots. And this was not a good situation, because it was getting to be a very sore thumb in the public perception, not so much of the external public, but in all of the rich, what were called FCCIs. The FCCI was a word for a pre-clearance flag. It stood for Flag Case Completion Intensive, which originated on the ship. Somebody would be brought to flag for a case completion intensive, and the term it just referred to somebody that came to the ship, was called an FCCI. And this transferred to the land base in Clearwater. And the so these people, many of them, most of them, not every single one, was very well heeled. And they would come to the base and they would see that maybe in their eyes what their auditor was eating was offensive to them.
Mm.
They said, how can you live on that stuff? And while the staff member himself might not be put out by it, the public was. So there was a perception that what's going on with these people. Now, on a ship is a very tight environment, and that stuff, you know, you're in close quarters, and you live in a situation that is not normal just because you're on a ship. And so these things can kind of be swept under the rug, and they're not so important. They're not noticed. There's no public perception because, you know, the public wasn't watching how the staff lived on the ship. And when you get out into the so-called real world, there is a disparity between, and there certainly was a big disparity between the public and the staff in Clearwater. Now, that was noticed, you know, by myself very early on in 1976 when we came ashore. But when you move it up to 1980, and especially when the Knox boom happened, people were just flooding the Fort Harrison, and so basically it was acknowledged by Hubbard through his own lines of communication that the staff needed to be de-oppressed. Now, this was based upon, and you could talk to, God, almost anybody in management, and they will not know of what I'm about to tell you because, frankly, they weren't briefed on it. I was only briefed on it by reason of the fact that I was part of his secretarial pool, and we were supposed to know everything he was doing within reason. We weren't necessarily briefed on all that inner guardian's office stuff. When I said the dirty business, we weren't necessarily briefed on that. We might know about certain things, but certainly not the inside ops. And he probably wasn't in on the inside ops because this was being done by lower level minions. But in any case, the de-oppression was based upon research he was doing. He intended to write a book originally in 1976 at the bicentennial of the United States of America. It was on freedom. And he had stated that freedom on this planet was non-existent. The only vestiges that there was in the United States based upon the revolution, and that was echoed in the French Revolution. So he viewed the revolution in America and the French Revolution of the late 1700s as very focal points in humanity as far as having some vestige of what he called freedom by his own perspective. Now, all of this French Revolution stuff, and I would focus more on the French Revolution and then the American Revolution, although they were sister revolutions, both inspired by Freemasonry, is that you know, if the population is too oppressed, it's going to rebel. And then when it rebels, you have to give them some, you have to assuage it. You have to placate it. Now, so in other words, you give them something. Now, the more you give them, the more you have to be very careful because then they'll demand more back. So it's a very very dicey tightrope you have to negotiate. Because you have to not give them too much, but that they're going to rebel more. And he actually talked about this in the Problems of Work. He talked about the Mr. Hershey, who made the chocolate bar Hershey. He talks about the factory workers revolting when he made conditions perfect for them. They had a big revolt, a violent revolt, as I recall. So, in other words, you have to be careful what you give. Now, because the staff had been so oppressed, they had to, like, okay, would have a meeting. And this was sort of like it was actually a more precise version of a group engram session. whereby people would go to you and ask you individually, but you were all members of, say, management. I was part of the management org at that time, and I was briefed on and read the confidential flag orders because I was in qual, and I was entitled and supposed to know it. Most of the staff didn't read all the issues.
Yeah, this is in Florida, right?
This is in Florida, yeah.
Yeah. What year? 76?
Oh, no. See, I heard about this stuff in 76 when the book was supposed to come out, but the book never was finished. It was a book that he never wrote.
Okay.
He was also working on a book called Dianetics Plus 22, which was supposed to be released in 1972. That eventually became Dianetics Today.
Okay.
Because things don't happen on the clock schedule. But in any case, in 19 so there was a technology that went with this book, or that he wanted to implement, and it was to de-oppress the staff. So basically, you'd be asked, what is wrong, sort of thing. What do you need? All these questions.
And so, sorry, what year was this again? We're about 80, was it?
Okay, I'm sorry, 1980, I think.
Okay.
No. 1980 is when I believe it started. Maybe 1981. It's definitely in that period, because in 81 is when it really hit the fan, so to speak. And see, because what happened is, so they'd ask you, people generally said, okay, they didn't have enough money. They needed, so they made sure everybody had proper uniforms. They made sure everybody, when the Sea Org made sure everybody had the Sea Org pay was increased from, I think, $17 to $24, and bonuses were implemented on top of that. So it became much less challenging for the average staff to have whatever amenities they needed. And it made it more fun for the staff. And actually it made it much more productive. The international stats went up. It was a very, period of high morale for the management staff. Now, when you ignite something like that, and all of a sudden you had a resurgence in the staff, it was more fun to be a staff member. People were getting their study time, et cetera, et cetera. And this sort of leaks out, like the theta leaks out into the field, basically. So when the staff at the management level are being de-oppressed, it leaks out into, and this is the management level, it leaks out into the orgs. It leaks out into the field.
Yeah.
It leaks out into the mission holders. And the mission holders were very cognizant of certain things that had been wrong. So you had, not only was the management staff now getting some modicum of fairness and equilibrium and equity, it started to apply to the public. Well, the public weren't being treated right in certain instances. So they began to correct all of this errant behavior, and abuses were being acknowledged in a way that they hadn't been acknowledged on a group basis. So it was a time of resurgence. At the same time, the Knots boom was happening. It was the most exciting time I had ever witnessed in the history of Dianetics and Scientology, a movement which I started in 1971. I came in on the boom that occurred in 1971. And then it was 10 years later, and I said, wow, this was so wonderful. Now, what happened was you had mission holders. I got on lines at the Davis mission, which is in Northern California. I knew the mission holder there, Martin Samuels. There was other mission holders, a guy named Kinsley Wimbush in Santa Clara, which is south part of the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. He was a very popular mission holder. There was a guy named J.C. Hughes in San Diego. And these guys were just bringing in numbers. The gross income in these missions got as high as $100,000, $200,000 in a week.
It's
Now that is a
huge. It's huge.
tremendous amount for a mission. Orgs didn't make that. Now, a lot of this was just on what you'd say word of mouth hyperbola. And I do not say that word hyperbola pejoratively or insultingly. I mean, it was, but you just get all this excitement and enthusiasm. And it was like, oh man. And so then this was a time when they started having, putting out packs on coffee shop auditing. Coffee shop auditing was something you were never supposed to do. Well, all of a sudden they said, you can do coffee shop auditing. You can do book one auditing. And there was a book one auditing program that was just fantastic. People would get regular book one auditing from the original Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, and they would just be fantastic. And
What exactly do you mean by coffee shop auditing?
Coffee shop auditing was a term that was a pejorative term. So you had coffee shop auditing, which means that you went out with some Scientologist went out to a coffee shop with either somebody who was on lines or not on lines, and they started running processes in the coffee shop, sort of ad hoc.
Yeah.
And just started auditing them without any formality.
Yeah.
And this was always, it was in the old original pamphlet that's called the Scientology Dictionary before we had the big thick thing. And this coffee shop auditing was a no-no. But then all of a sudden they were saying it's a yes, because actually you want to, if the waitress is peeing her pants, you say, well, there's a way to handle that, and go back to an incident. And she's sitting there, in between servicing other customers or whatever process you're running on her. I'm being kind of facetious here. And you fix her right there in the waitress, right there in the restaurant, and then you bring her into the organization. It was, informal auditing, and there was a pack put together called coffee shop auditing in 1901 or so.
And LRH would have approved this?
Well, David Mayo was the one who put it together, and David Mayo was very much in good graces with LRH at the time. It was not anything that was considered radical. It was a Division 6 public division incentive imperative. So this was not to be done, by your auditors working in the HGC or Hubbard Guidance Center. This was to be done by the public.
Yeah.
So, on the public divisions. And so anyway, you had all this book one auditing frenzy, and it was driving people into the orgs. Now, so anyway, what you had a lot of injustices coming up. And so this was 1981. And I remember they were having the public, and this is all through the Mission Holder Network, was starting to unite and say, wow. And so they had this big meeting in Clearwater, and they got together, and they were it was like a revolt is what it was, but it was a revolt it reminded me of the Vietnam War era. And so basically they were revolting against some unfair things that had happened to them.
This is a Mission Holders Conference, isn't it?
Yes. And it's very famous. You can read about aspects of it. Now, most of the staff, the management staff were, really didn't know what was going on. Some of them did. Some of them were in the Division 6 areas. Some of the people who were right on public lines in the Flag Service Organization were. And of course, I had very good communication lines. Not only because I worked in Qual, so it was my job to have a very, very viewpoints of everything that was going on, but I also had a lot of LRH viewpoint from having worked in his personal office. I also had extensive communications with the public through my own personal associations and friendships. So I could read, what was going on, not only have data, but actually feel the energy of what was going on. So I actually attended some of those meetings, these revolt meetings, but I didn't sit in the audience. I sat outside and I watched from outside the door. And of course, if most staff went to those, it would have been considered a no-no. I could do it because I'm qual. I'm there to correct what's wrong, to see what's wrong. So if something's going wrong, it's my job to know it. So I could do it with impunity. But I didn't make a spectacle of myself. Nobody really knew I was there. They could have looked, but nobody was paying attention to me. They were paying attention to the rabble rousing that was going on by the speakers. And basically, all sorts of grievances were being issued, were being expressed. And you had people from back as far as 1950 in that room who were now there to get their grievances addressed. And it was, and they were getting addressed. And there was a man who was then working in the then Guardian's office. He was a pretty famous character in Scientology. His name was Owen Starkey. Owen Starkey, I had first encountered him on the Apollo when I first got there. I don't know if I met him, but I remember he was going back to Denmark where he worked as a registrar and an executive, eventually a Knots auditor. And he ended up in the Guardian's office. And he said to me, he says, all lawsuits against the Church of Scientology have been dropped. And the reason they were dropped, suspended might have been a better word, but they were dropped because Scientology began communicating with their adversaries. He actually told me this.
Yeah.
And there's no reason to believe he was lying. But what happened is the mission holders were showing up the staff. In other words, they're having hundreds of thousands of dollars a week. Orgs didn't do this. So all of a sudden, management was being shown up by the mission holders. Now, although they were being shown up in terms of gross income, the mission holders did not pretend to have anywhere near the technical or management skill that the orgs themselves did, including the management org. They were good at dealing with the public. When it came to more precision, they said the orgs are going to do a better job than our missions will.
Did the missions get people up to clear?
No, not at that time. I mean, it was getting into this Dianetic clear phase, so, but they would have to be declared clear in an organization at that time. But basically, what the situation was is that in terms of what is it, suppressive PTS SP technology, the orgs could, or the management staff could not have the mission holders being so successful. And the mission holders wanted everybody to be successful. And the higher up in management you were, typically speaking, the more anal retentive you were with regards to having issues about the public or the mission holders being okay. So the worst aspect of this was when the current leader of Scientology, David Miscavige, came down to the mission holder meeting because this was a revolt they had to quell. And it came down with David Mayo, who was completely clueless as to what the hell was going on. He was just clueless. He had been working with LRH, doing the Knots stuff, and working on the happiness rundown, but he was clueless as to what was going on with the public at that particular time. A guy named Jens Bogvad, who was a very popular commanding officer in Europe. He was Swedish, and he was mostly known for his work in Germany. But he was there, and Norman Starkey was sent down. I guess he was sent down as supposedly the muscle, and to quell any physical disturbances. And I saw Norman outside the management building, and what's going on? He says, "Oh, nothing's going on. Nothing's going on over there." I thought, no. It's like he was there to dissuade that there was any sort of upheaval.
Yeah.
And of course, I knew him from the ship, and he was essentially full of bull, but using a PR line. And so anyway, I went over there, and Miscavige basically quelled them, told them how he had basically taken over from Mary Sue, and presented himself as something other than what he was, they were kind of shocked to hear that who he was. They found out that he was in charge, but he appeased them to a certain degree. And then when he went back and whatever he reported, I don't know what he reported to LRH. I don't know what he didn't, but basically he went and slowly began to target the mission holders and declare them one by one. And then they had a big meeting later in '82 where he declared a lot of them on the spot. And Scientology at that point became a crazy organization.
Yeah.
And it became so psychotic that all this book one auditing phenomena that was going on, they said anybody that had book one auditing now had to go to the org and get an exam so that the org could now have control of that particular pre-clear.
Yeah, hold on, and can I bring up something as well? Yeah,
sure.
because this is what's going on in the church. It's like the way it is today is it's so controlled. It's like the Scientology members that are members of the church, they can't just go out and practice book one auditing, and they can't just practice the tech and experiment with it and learn, not screw or anything, but they can't just go and do book one. And it just sort of suppresses them and it cuts down Dianetics. So what you have in the church is you end up having just one person trained, and they're usually pretty crap at it in delivering Dianetic book one auditing, and you have to go to the church to get that, and it's just not good.
No, totally. And you see, if one understood the Division 6 policy as written by L. Ron Hubbard, you would see that these groups, gung-ho groups, are supposed to feed the org people, and they're going to feed it. They might feed them 100, and if they're smart, they'll get 10 or 20, and the rest of them might go by. But you just get people reading that original Dianetics book and just feeding it in and getting the enthusiasm, and it's the org's job to capitalize on the enthusiasm, not to control every particle in there and treat it as something that you have to exert total control over something, and you don't even have somebody who's intelligent to use the technology to make that person want to do Scientology. You start abusing the person rather than just feeding them theta, so to speak.
Yeah, so and also it's like they're making out as if, because this is obviously where this really started to happen, where it became a lot more stricter. They're making out as if it's a dangerous and a scary thing to mess with your case and to try Dianetic auditing without a professional certified auditor at the actual official org. They're making it all scary. Oh no, don't mess with your case and all this sort of stuff.
Well, yes, and there is a bulletin written by LRH that said, opening up the mind is, I forget. I used to know this stuff really well, but you open up the mind. There's no danger. It's better to open up the mind than to not open it up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But so you basically had people that were ignorant of the actual policies, and there's nobody who was more incompetent and ignorant when it came to the day in and day out policy and technology of L. Ron Hubbard than David Miscavige. He did not understand it, and he was not the only one that didn't understand it because he had seized the power lines. All of a sudden, things were going wacky. Now, it's taken me many years, because I followed the Scientology movement. I left in '83, and I followed the movement on the internet, the various people who've had their falling out and change of heart and whatnot. But it's taken me only in the last few years have I begun to actually able to determine to my satisfaction that L. Ron Hubbard suffered from dementia and, just dementia towards the last years of his life. And it came in different degrees. Now, because as of 1982, the L. Ron Hubbard, and I really don't know what he did say and didn't say, because Miscavige was right there on the focal point. He was in a position to screw everything up.
Yeah, the communications.
Yes, but the thing is that Hubbard was no longer the Hubbard I knew. and the Hubbard I had worked for. And I had verified this with one of his messengers who was much closer to him than I was. She was with him on a day in and day out basis on the ship. And of course she says, no, this wasn't the same. I met with her last year in New York City, and she says, no, I agree with you. It's not the same.
And what year are you talking about that he started to get dementia?
Well, this is hard to say, but if you go onto the internet and look at the postings, I think it's on the ex-Scientology message board, there's a character called Cowboy. His posts are under trepidatious, and he comes out and starts telling about his personal experiences as a messenger with L. Ron Hubbard. Well, Cowboy was a very close personal friend of mine. He was a young kid, and he kind of befriended me rather than the other way around. But we were friends, and we'd go out on liberties together or whatever. And I remember he left, and I think it was 76. He left the Clearwater to go be at the secret base, and I remember he came back once and was visiting Clearwater, and he was telling me how it was after the Knots boom and after LRH's first bout where he, I think, went unconscious in the desert. And he said that LRH, when he was helping LRH work on Knots, develop Knots, and he told me that, well, LRH was great. He was spotless. He was humorous. He was, he sort of validated everything that I had known about Hubbard in a positive sense. And then one day he disappeared, and we never knew what happened to him. He had I guess, a guardian who was a good friend of mine, because his father was a Scientologist, and he had a guardian who was not his father. He was on good terms with his parents, but he had joined the Sea Org he must have been 16 years old or something like that. But his guardian told me, he says, I don't know what happened to him. I don't know what happened to him. And we just couldn't reconcile it. I never knew what happened to him till he emerged, 25 years later as Cowboy on the internet. I still haven't taken the trouble to talk to him. And he has not wanted his identity to be known. It was very easy for me to obviously figure out who he was when I saw what he was saying. But he said that LRH was suffering from dementia and had good days and bad days, and he sort of developed a very sour taste in his mouth for LRH because he saw things misfiring. He saw LRH misfiring like crazy. And of course, one of the things with Hubbard, and this was one thing that, when I worked for him in his personal office, one of my duties was to explain to people that he got 8 hours of sleep a night, that he was a regular human being, that he was not a god. And people had all sorts of projections about him, which were their own projections. And, you'd have somebody like Captain Bill Robertson would go out on a mission, and he'd say, LRH only sleeps 4 hours a night. Or he even sleeps no hours a night. And you've got to get out there and do, and I'd tell people, I'd say, this is bullshit. He'd be there with all this authority, and I'd be sitting there in the next, compartment on the ship, and saying, this is not true. I wasn't going to go up in his face and because he was there on an official mission, and tell him he was full of shit.
Yeah.
But he was, and I would tell people this, and this is a funny story if you want to hear it.
Okay, hold on. So yeah, we're going a bit off topic. So we'll get back to this whole mission holders conference thing, but I do want to ask what it was like working with LRH, and do you trust Ron Zorg and Captain Bill with other information he talks about?
Do I trust Ron Zorg? Well, I have no affiliation with Ron Zorg, so it's like, that's kind of like, asking me would I trust the New Zealand military. I have no interaction with the.
Okay, but do you trust? I know you said Captain Bill was exaggerating how much LRH sleeps and stuff, but if Bill Robertson
Yeah.
started up an indie org, would you trust the tech in that org and everything like that?
Uh, my first impression would be I have no use for it. Trusting it, it depends who's doing what. I mean, from what I've seen of Ron's org, and from what I've seen, and I don't claim to be a vast, a student or somebody who's particularly interested in. I could never take Captain Bill seriously because I don't know how well people know. I saw Captain Bill from the way LRH's office saw Captain Bill, and he was a very, I guess what you'd say, flamboyant, dynamic figure who could do a lot of. He had some leadership skills, and he was not. I mean, he could run a ship. He could objectively run a ship, but I had always viewed him as one crazy bastard, and I say bastard. I don't. I mean, I'm just saying is this guy. This was a guy who would have the staff of the advanced organization in Los Angeles dress up in to look like spacemen. And
Why?
this is, well, don't tell me why he did it because he, it was like make them look like the cover of the old Dianetics 55 book, to make them look like whole track implanters or whatever. They'd wear a boiler suit with a motorcycle helmet, and I mean, this is just crazy. So what I'm saying is, and then I guess Diana finally ordered it stopped because it was horrible public relations. So and now you also, if you want to study up on Captain Bill, he had a propensity to dress in women's clothing. Now this was done privately, so he was like a transvestite. This was part of his sexuality, his unresolved sexuality.
So
Now,
this isn't just black PR. Like
no,
is this the
it's not
truth?
black
I don't.
PR. This is not black PR. This is from people who worked in HCO and had to process this stuff, process this information, and say, well, we've got this guy. I mean, because when you go to the ethics officer, there's a dossier on you, and it's part of what makes you wrong, and this was part of his persona. Now, that's not to say that I will say one thing about Captain Bill. When we were taking the ship, and this is the most interfacing I ever had to deal with him, was when we were going from the Apollo to Clearwater, and I was in the SO number 1 unit at the time, and we were supposed to remain on board the ship till to the very end in the Bahamas. And so we were in the Bahamas for like, at 6 weeks. It was like a vacation, snorkeling every day. And, I remember we had to get off the coast of Nassau, the island where Nassau, I don't know if the city is called Nassau in the Bahamas, the capital city, but we were anchored off there for a long time. And he would give us briefings every night or frequently at dinner. This was the whole crew that was left. We were probably about 100 of us left. And he was hysterically funny. He was funny. He was dealing with the public people. He was just very entertaining, and he was very enjoyable. And he wasn't talking about the Galactic Patrol or anything like that. And he could certainly run a ship and negotiate with the people in the ports and whatnot. And so I enjoyed him during that time period. But as you go forward and he comes across your lines in various and sundry ways, and he never portrayed himself as a person that had all of his marbles together, but he did certainly have a lot of admiration for L. Ron Hubbard, perhaps too much. So as to what goes on in Ron's org, I can't speak for that because I just can't speak for it because I have no experience with it.
Yeah, and can I quickly ask you something? So you're very much into very unusual things, right? Like all this time travel stuff, and Montauk and everything, right? So and obviously you've looked into aliens a lot and that sort of stuff. So what do you think of some of the stuff that Captain Bill or Ronzal talks about aliens? The truth of it.
Oh, I want to correct that. I'm not really into aliens. That I mean, somebody could perceive that from looking at the web. And I did write a book called Encounter in the Pleiades, an inside look at UFOs. But that's basically my co-author, Preston Nichols, and I am, editing his verbiage.
Yeah.
So I'm not a big fan, and I was dealing in the 1990s with all sorts of people who had abduction experiences, and there was a certain mythos of this alien race and that alien race. And there was a lot of people having a lot of consternation. I really wasn't into it per se. It was sort of some of the stuff I had to sort of process or audit through, so to speak. I'm much more, and that's not to say that I don't say aliens don't exist, but I don't fill my head with that sort of paradigm. So when you're talking about Captain Bill's view of the world, I don't take it too seriously. I think I think there's a lot of imbalance in people that spend a lot of time thinking about aliens, thinking about the whole track, because the whole track is a much bigger illusion, I have found, than I realized. And that's not to say that you didn't live before, but the more I understand about time and illusion, I don't have necessarily the same perspective I had when I was a Scientologist, because you're dealing with a time track. And what I would tell you is there's a multiplicity of time tracks.
Okay, can you elaborate on that?
Well, time is by its very nature a beginning and an end. And this, you see this in the statement of Christ, Alpha. I am Alpha and Omega. That's the beginning and the end. In the science of time, you have the future is the past and the past is the future. So you have what's called a timeline. So, when do things begin? You have a multiplicity of time. So, in other words, a timeline is a disembarking from this timeline. In other words, you can go off on another timeline. And so basically, anytime you change time or disembark from this moment in time, every moment in time has infinite potential of different venues you can take. Like you can go right now where you go drink a glass of water. You can go one where you drink a glass of Coke, one where you can drink a glass of Sprite or drink something healthy. You can do all these different bifurcations of the timeline, and every moment has an infinity of timelines in front of itself. And just because you didn't go down one path doesn't mean it did not exist. Now, this is so when you kind of, and now, of course, I benefited from going back in time and clearing my own, engrams or confusions or whatnot. And it's sort of released from it. And then I was no longer interested in my whole track per se. I sort of, the process for me, I was clear from it. This is just in my own personal experience. So I don't feel any need to go back there digging and digging and digging, because I've gated in other phenomena into my life, which includes a time travel scientist who can, by all knowledge, and I've only seen it in video format, can change time, literally slow it down or speed it up. And this sort of feeds what I just said. So in other words, I'm not trying to resolve the issues of the past in the sense that I was when I was doing Dynamics and Scientology. It's a different perspective.
Okay. All right. So, because there's so much we can talk about, but Let's go back to this Captain Bill wearing dresses thing. I find that quite interesting.
Well, as I say, you probably find it online, but I mean, I heard this internally from people that were internal, and he did you know, when I remember he had taken on this woman named Daphne Dan, and this was, somebody told me, Captain Bill has married a countess. I said, what? Now he was in the desert at that time. I was still in Clearwater. I said, what are you talking about? I eventually found out this countess was a woman named Daphne Dan. And I mean, I'm just knee slapping and laughing because I had encountered Daphne Dan twice in my, she was Israelite. And I remember I first encountered her when I was standing at the reception desk, which was called the court, I was the QM quartermaster in the Hollywood Inn. I had this duty there to stand on duty for 4 hours, and she comes in, and she's a blonde, and has a very, I guess what you'd say, over sexy valence, and she says, "Oh, I'm looking for David Rapp," and and I don't even know that she was supposed to come in, but she was visiting him and having a sexual relationship with him. He was the dishwasher. He had been a registrar, and he was now, serving some sort of punishment. He was a dishwasher in the Flag Operations Liaison Office, West US, which was located in the Hollywood Inn. And I said, oh, okay, whatever. I don't know. She says, I'm here to see David. I found out later that she was having what would be called, for the Sea Org, an illicit relationship with him. And I said, this was it was inappropriate behavior. And it was kind of outrageous behavior that she's, I didn't know what it was about. And then that's where I first encountered her. And then later, when I was review chief and I was doing a qualifications cycle on the international justice chief, and she had been declared, and he gets a call from her, and he says, she's inviting him over to her apartment, she wants to discuss her suppressive declare with him. And of course, this was an inducement to seduce him, and he would have nothing to do with it. But I mean, this is where I said, who is this crazy lady, And anyway, Captain Bill basically embraced her, married her, brought her to the desert where LRH either was or had been, and it was a complete security breach. You don't bring somebody there without. I mean, this was a complete violation of protocol. You never did that if you were smart. And so Captain Bill got in a lot of hot water for that because he was very seducible on the second dynamic. He didn't have his. I mean, we can all make that mistake. I've made it myself. But this woman was just, in my opinion, with all of the training that I'd had, was a complete, negative person to be involved with. I then later heard that, she had taken about $30,000 of his money or something like this when they were in Spain. And he got all upset, and I think they might have had a falling out over that. But I said, man, his perception of people was not too good. Now, it was during that time period that he had prepared these HCOBs to emulate to make them look just like they were from L. Ron Hubbard. And when he had been, trying to recruit people for the Galactic Patrol or whatever it was, he sent out this full pack, and he had an HCOB that sort of said, and these went to all the orgs. He went to considerable expense to send them the orgs, and they had one delivered to the Flag Management org. And I remember seeing it in qual. It was opened up. It was shown to me, and it basically said highly confidential. It said Dianetics and Scientology, the supreme implant. And it was an HCOB, obviously written by Captain Bill, but it had L. Ron Hubbard's name, and it said the supreme implant, in the universe is Dianetics and Scientology. And it went on to talk about how Dianetics and Scientology was in and of itself an implant. And this was sort of his inducement to get people to listen to him. And you know what? He was kind of right. You know, when I saw that, I was still in the management staff, and I said, you know, I began to see that, you know, he's kind of right. It was, Dianetics and Scientology had become an implant. It was there to relieve implants, and now it was an implant.
And what year would this have been?
This would have been 1982.
Yeah, this was when he was leaving.
Yeah, so again, I wouldn't say that, you know, everything that he did was bad, and he had a likable side to him. But from the positions that I held, he was never anybody that I could take seriously whatsoever. I mean, you know, just like, and this was typical, because when you read all of the letters from Scientologists across the world, you had a different viewpoint than they did, and you saw that they could not be taken too seriously because so many of their ideas were such projections. That's not to say, I'm saying not to say that they couldn't be taken too seriously as human beings, but their conclusions and decisions about what they were doing in Scientology were sometimes very incorrect or misguided. They could have all sorts of wild projections. And this has nothing to do with whole track stuff per se. It's just, you know, the way people perceive things. They make their own conclusions.
They're just too funky.
Well, whatever. It's like, you know, or they might be too preoccupied. Like, for example, when Quentin died, Elrich's son, you know, all these letters coming in from people who had multiple letters. There were definitely dozens, if not hundreds, of people who had kids, and they said, you know, we've got Quentin. Quentin is now with us. And, you know, this was in considerable bad taste, but it's just people projecting like crazy. And
well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? I don't get it.
Are you asking me a question? What do I mean by that?
Yeah, like what they were writing in letters saying that they've got Quentin.
Well, that means that their baby was Quentin. He had reincarnated into their family.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. In other words, this is like, I mean, you know, and people would make all sorts of assertions, you know, and it's like, how many people, when this would come up in auditing or in letters, you know, hey, I got my auditing and I realized that I'm Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, thank you very much. We'll put your name on the list.
Yeah.
And I had learned this. If you took all the people that went through auditing and that were at the crucifixion or were Jesus, they could fill a soccer stadium.
Do you think they're tapping into the Akashic record or something?
Well, what are they tapping into? They're tapping into, I don't know if I would classify it as the Akashic record. They're tapping into an idea, a meme that has been, I guess what you'd say, perpetrated on humanity. If it's not the exact definition of an implant as L. Ron Hubbard gave, it's something so close to it as to be, you know, can't differentiate it too much. It's just like on television. But what is it when you see TV? If you go back, I don't even know how old you are, but if you go back into some of the movies, in the 1950s movies, the religious movies, they are so hysterical today because they're so fixed on the way they present Christianity and history. One of my favorites, I think it's The Robe or it's Demetrius and the Gladiators. One was the sequel to the other. But I remember they say that the Christians died. Their bodies were chewed up by the lions, which the lions didn't kill people, didn't kill Christians like that they portrayed. But they all had smiles on their faces. You know, because they faced death with smiles. Well, you know, when you devour a human body with either swords or by lions eating them, they're not going to be smiling. And it's like, it's just so ridiculous the way religion has been, the stories of Christianity have been displayed on TV. They've been fed it's fed. And what are those based upon? What are those ideas based upon? They're based upon fixed thinking. Where does the fixed thinking come from? Does it come from? I don't think it comes from the Akashic records, which would be the actual historical events that took place, but rather something that is very akin to an implant station, if not that itself.
Yes. So just to wrap up the Captain Bill thing. So you don't think it was just black PR that he liked to? Because I heard that he liked to dress up in dresses and meet like UFOs, and I just thought that was so out there.
No, I mean I don't know about meeting UFOs, but no, but this is from his own. If you were to look in his ethics file, you would see, or his pre-clear file, you would find something of that order, and this has been verified for me personally by my colleagues who were had to deal with him. He just not somebody that I can or would take seriously. Would I trust him if he was the captain of a ship and had to get me from one port to another? Believe it or not, yeah. As long as he wasn't, he knew he was a sailor. He knew how to sail a boat, how to sail a ship, and I would say that I might. Not necessarily believe what he was saying around the campfire, but he was competent as a sailor. And I wouldn't say that about a lot of people I was in the Sea Org with, but I would say it about him.
Okay, and so what about LRH then? Do you believe he's this perfect person, it's not faultless, or do you think he's a bit too funky as well?
Well, definitely not a perfect person. I never thought he was a perfect person. He was never portrayed to me as a perfect person. So this is a lot of projection that people do. And I remember one of my first pre-clears, I was doing a CS1 on when I was, just a public Scientologist. And he was telling me that he talked to somebody and that LRH, looked real young and he had an aura all about him. And, I think he said he had a rainbow aura around him, and I thought, this poor guy's full of bull. My pre-clear is full of bull. I didn't tell him he was full of bull, and it was based upon, and he believed it. And I said, what do you believe this stuff for? I didn't say that to him because it was not my role. But he had all this like enthusiasm that LRH was like this, mini god or a god or something. And where does this come from? I didn't subscribe to it. So,
well, did you see LRH do some amazing OT things when you were working on the ship?
No, I wouldn't say, not in the sense that you're probably asking. Did he do amazing OT things? He never was portrayed that way. Where he was interesting. I mean, it depends where you draw the line with OT. Did I see him doing physical things? No, and nor was that sort of mindset fed or encouraged. What I was interested in when I got to the ship was the whole process of auditing, and there I was put almost immediately on the Dianetic internship, and as an auditor, where I was briefed on a daily basis on his expanded Dianetics research and his research into evil intentions. And so and this was over my head because I wasn't trained at that level, but I absorbed a lot of the information, and it would really help me later when I would get involved with expanded Dianetics auditing. And it gave me a very deep appreciation of the research he had done in 1972. That was of great interest to me. It was over my head at the time, but was that OT? Well, he was going into people's minds and discovering the plucking out of evil intentions and how these caused illness. And, so that was of great interest to me. But LRH is an OT. Scientology on the Apollo was more about, getting things done rather than, could somebody project themselves over the bow of the ship when we're at sea and, go to the next port and tell you what it looked like. No, that just wasn't the order of the day.
Okay. Well, did you get to actually hang out with LRH like a friend would?
No, that was really not the way things were set up. LRH he had a research room on the sun deck. No, that wasn't the sun deck. It was actually below the sun deck on the promenade deck. And, he would have his messengers, always at least one messenger on duty to run his messages. There would be one outside. Down the hall, he would have his aides for each division. Mary Sue's office was down there. And this was not an area that you generally strolled about. You didn't go up there unless you had business. Now, you could walk on the starboard side, and that was you could walk there. And I remember being shown around the ship, walk right by. You'd see him in his research room working. And the port side of the ship on his level was often off limits. You didn't go on that side because he would often be auditing below decks. So when he was in session, a series of red lights would be on throughout the entire ship where you were not to make noise so you wouldn't disturb his auditing. And that was, he had his own, it was called the household unit that would serve to his personal needs. He had his own cook. He had his own steward. He had a whole organization within the organization to service his personal needs. Oh, the crew had its own galley, its own set of stewards, its own cooks, and then you had a management bureau. I mean, you had hundreds and hundreds of people. So he did not have the luxury. When I was told by friends of mine who were there, I came aboard 72, that in the earlier days when the ship was less populated, he was much more in a position to talk to the crew and, I know pal around is the right word, but interface with them and talk to them on a more, human basis. By the time I got there, you could see him walking on the deck and he, wave at you or nod at you or, and you had opportunities perhaps to talk to him. It wasn't set up. It was too many people for him to be, palling around with, so to speak.
Yeah. And so when the post that you had where you were working, was it in his office or?
No. There was so little space on that ship for the amount of people. When I worked in his personal office, it was 1975 is when I went to work, and this was in the Caribbean. I was in a very small compartment with, I think, 2 other guys, and it was so hot in there. This was in an area known as the tween decks, between the fore and aft well decks, and it was very hot in there. So that was several decks below. I also got permission to work while he was asleep. When you were in his personal office, you were supposed to be on deck when he was awake. And he would work into the night. I got permission to work during the daytime, so he didn't need me. He didn't need to call on me. So I would type letters during the daytime and be on a regular schedule. And of course, but he had his own research room, not even his aides. Nobody worked in his own personal office. He had down the hallway, he had his personal aides and Mary Sue, but he worked by himself.
But what exactly was your post?
I had many posts. When I first went to his office, I was a typist. Uh, I eventually became in charge of all of his replies. I was the replies officer for all of his replies. I then was later, you know, a letter right. I would compose his letters. I was eventually promoted out of there into qualifications. I was still designated in his personal office, but qualifications for management. Uh,
Give,
Go
give
ahead.
give me an example on a typical day. What would be discussed in some of these communications that you were coming across?
Well, you would, if you're talking about in his personal office, you'd be reading letters from people. They could have been from Australia, Europe, uh, the United States, of people saying how, dear Ron, I think, I did this level, I did that level, it's fantastic, or I just found out about Scientology, thank you. Most of the letters were gushing with enthusiasm and appreciation. Um, and of course, these were the letters you liked to deal with because your job was to respond to them. You had to respond to them in a way that he would have responded to them, which would be very high toned. It made you raise your tone level to a very high level to respond to them because he would respond with a lot of enthusiasm. Whereas you might personally not give a damn that this guy had a wonderful success or wins in the far off corners of where you are in Melbourne or in Perth or in some Port Elizabeth, South Africa. You might just not give a damn about it, but he would have cared. So you had to you know emulate him and say, well, this is fantastic what you've done. By the way, you know, have you looked into this or whatever? You would give it your best to make it, and so you sort of got into his headspace, and of course somebody would correct you. There was somebody to read your response and tell you whether, and if it was fine, it was fine. If it was not, it would have to be redone.
So a lot of
So,
these letters weren't even gone actually to LIH. Like, did you get to read much of them?
well, there were far too many for one human being to read because you got to remember. I mean, I could do, and there was different gyrations of what happened. There was a time when I would dictate them into a phone and I didn't type them at all. I would just dictate the reply and somebody else would type it. There were times earlier than that when I would take the dictation and type it myself. So there was, uh, now, if you're spending uh, at least 8 hours a day composing or typing letters, and there are other people doing it besides you, how much time does he have to read? He would have a summary sent to him. Or if it was a highly sensitive letter, like I remember Robert Heinlein, the correspondence with Heinlein would go to him. What little of it there was, but I remember an extensive letter written to him from Heinlein to him and him back to Heinlein. And I remember typing it, but it was not, my composition. So, when famous person, I remember Chick Corea, he wrote out a letter by hand, had to be typed. Um, it wasn't like he wasn't involved, but how much time? Like when he would get gifts, he would get hundreds and hundreds of gifts for his birthday or for Christmas, and they'd all be like tagged, this is from so and so, because he'd have to go through a whole room full of gifts and say, this is from so and so, it's such and such, this is from so and so. And sometimes he'd say, well, tell this person that. But he didn't even have time to open all his gifts. They'd have to be opened for him, and he'd have to look at them. And, what could he do with them?
Yeah. Yeah, because it's interesting because some people say that when LRH went offline, they could notice how the letters seemed like they weren't authentically from LRH, and So that was sort of happening a bit earlier than what people think.
You know, um, they were always subject to being letters that weren't too good. This was always something that could come up. Uh, and it would depend who was writing the letters. Some people were better at it than others. And the more, I left the letter writing office in, God, it was 1979. And, and there was but the person left behind had been his personal secretary. She was very good at it. Um, but then, when she went off, I don't know who was left. You have people that didn't know him or weren't, then the quality would have been subject to suffering, indeed. So that's quite possible that did happen. Because the people that were close to him were purged out of the organization.
So what about some of these, without getting into too much confidential OT sort of stuff, but what were some of the juicier, really interesting things that you came across while handling this post?
Well, when you say juicy, and I remember one of my colleagues, he would say, I got a juicy GO letter. He was always trying to get his paws in this juicy stuff, and he shouldn't. He actually got dismissed from the office because he started reading OT3 data, and he wasn't on that level. So he had this obsessive curiosity about OT3, and he got himself bounced out of the office and the Sea Org for that. Of course, he was always talk about a juicy GO letter, meaning a letter. See, there were certain letters that there was a mail opener, and the mail opener would basically take the letters, and the mail opener did not respond to the letters. It was always a she when I worked there, and she would look at the letters to see if they contained any legal threat. And if they contained a legal threat, they would be sent to the guardian's office, or they'd be put in a special category where the guardian's office would be informed and liaised with. If they were a delivery complaint where the org was screwing up, that she'd just include those with the regular good roads and fair weather letters. The guardian's office letters were called GO letters, and they would not come to the regular correspondent writers. And they would generally go to the in charge of the unit. But sometimes these GO letters would not be spotted correctly, and we would get a GO letter, which would be some god-awful story. And I say, I didn't keep a log of them. I might remember them. If it was a letter about LRH's magical exploitations with Jack Parsons, that was not considered a GO letter. People be sending in data about Jack Parsons or whatnot. That would happen occasionally. Most times people were writing about their own experiences. A GO letter, I remember one in particular, was it particularly juicy? It was about some guy that was in a wheelchair in DC, and he was very upset because LRH was part of the registration cycle. And, basically he met with him, and LRH, according to the letter, said that he could, benefit from this. And then, of course, he was somebody who the auditing didn't work out for him. He wanted a refund, and he talked about how they snuck LRH out the back door so he wouldn't have to confront him. And he was a very angry person. And this is not a letter that I should have ever had to deal with. Whether it was true or not, who knows? But the person was very angry. And this was probably, 20 years after the fact, maybe 15 years after it happened. The guy was still angry. So that sort of a letter where it would become a sensitive, if his daughter would write in, Alexis, the daughter he had with Sarah Northrop, that was a whole special handling that I was not, going to be involved in personally, because that actually went to him himself, and I was, read on it. Letters from his son. I was briefed on these things, but I was not, it was not my job to read the letter and, I mean, but you got smatterings of these things. And of course, I was briefed on the letters because we were supposed to know and everything that LRH thought, and how he responded to things. But as they say, that was a small part of your day. I do remember talking about confidential data. I do remember Pat Broker coming in one day, and Pat Broker is, of course, the one who was with LRH in the final years. And I knew Pat. I got along with him very well. And he was visiting Clearwater, and he came into our office, and he briefed us on the movie Revolt in the Stars. And he told us about how LRH had brought his messengers into the room, but he made anybody who had not done the OT3 level leave the room first before he briefed us on this. And he began to tell us how that movie had all this stuff from the OT3 incident. And of course, I had done OT3 by that time. And it was rather shocking to hear that LRH was had not only written a script that had all the much of the OT3 information in it, he was saying it right in front of his messengers who had never done OT3, these particular messengers. So this was LRH just completely, violating his own rules.
So do you think that's maybe because, I mean, I heard something that enough people at that stage had confronted this incident so that it'd been destimulated so that now you could release a script to help everyone hear about it and get destimulated by it or something?
Well, you can make an argument for that because life in 1968 is much different than life in 1978. And you can make an argument for that. Certainly, the way Scientologists looked at it, that argument, would have borne some weight. It certainly would have been the only justification for him doing what he was doing. What I have read was that the purpose of that was to basically re-stimulate people and make them interested in getting audited. In other words, it was creating a need. Well, I have all this stuff going on in my head. Scientology will help me get rid of it. Because people are, by and large, suggestible. And you see this in advertising all the time. So if you put something out, so I have, and certainly internally, I didn't hear that it was a marketing ploy, but apparently it was. And of course, the movie never went anywhere. The script never went anywhere.
This is how I see it. So I feel like the reason the OT levels were made confidential was because, and LIH sort of says this, because, some people were getting hold of the auditing tech and applying it to people who weren't ready for it or misapplying it. But if you just release a story, that's different to releasing the actual processing because you can't harm anyone with a story.
Well, I can tell you from my experiences, and this came from a friend of mine who told me the detailed story of why the levels were originally made confidential. And this was pre-OT. This was what was called R6EW, Routine 6 and Words, which was the level prior to grade 6, it was called. It was the level on the grade chart prior to level 7, which was the clearing course, and this is at St. Hill. There was a very, famous man, Alan Walter, who many people have heard in the independent Scientology. Alan Walter. He was an Aussie. He was a football, professional football player, very successful mission holder. Of course, I met Alan. He was very affable, very friendly. But in fact, it was during the times I had, interacted with him, which briefly, it was not an official interaction. He just happened to be in working or hanging out in the office that I had an assignment to. And I was told that Alan was the reason that the materials became confidential, because he was having a problem with his wife, and he was, chanting the R6EW commands at her, which were considered confidential and were considered highly stimulative. And they were having a lover's spat, and he was misusing the technology. And LRH said, "No more of this. This is going to be confidential. You don't talk about it. You don't use it," because it was considered highly stimulative. That might surprise or, piss off a lot of Alan Walters fans. But this is the story that I heard internally. I have no reason to disbelieve it. I'm not attached to it.
Yeah, well, I've heard someone once, some OT or something, arguing with a Scientology hater, and he was saying to him, he goes, "You're stuck in an electronic incident, blah, 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 blah." Like, he didn't give too much detail, but I can understand how someone can get into an argument with someone who knows high-level data, and they can start going, "You're blah, blah, blah." And I don't think it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly he was subject to his own human fallibilities. But this is what I had heard was the inception of the confidential data. And then, of course, if that's true, and if he saw, well, this is confidential, he could have fed off of that and made things more confidential. The other thing about L. Ron Hubbard is he very much was a believer in the idea of what he called a mystery sandwich. If you put out a mystery, it makes people all the more interested in it.
Yeah,
like
it does.
He did this with Excalibur, and OT3 was confidential.
Yeah.
And, it's confidential, it's hidden. And I can only say from my perspective, when I did the OT3 level, I was very, I guess what you'd call well-trained and well-heeled as an auditor. And doing the solo auditor's course was such a beautiful thing, because it didn't matter getting the OT3 yet, is that I could now audit myself. I could now deal with my own mind, and I didn't have to go through the encumbrances of trying to get another person to understand me. I didn't need another person to understand me. I could understand myself. So by the time I got to the OT3 level, I was very much in touch with me, my own rudiments or feelings, my own mind. And I read this stuff, and while I certainly could not relate to it, the processes were used as sort of a prop to address what was actually in my mind. And what was in my mind, I was able to release an incredible amount of, I guess what you'd call insisted energy, which gave me the full end phenomena of the level, which was full self-determinism. And when you become fully self-determined, you don't care what somebody thinks about Captain Bill. You don't care what Captain Bill thinks. You don't care what L. Ron Hubbard thinks. You care what you think and what is your determinism. This is your determinism. And one of the most puzzling things to me, or astonishing things, is when you look at all the gab on Scientology, everybody's concerned about what everybody else is thinking. Scientologists think this. Scientologists think this. L. Ron Hubbard was, it's like it's all people's opinions and experiences. And while they're not necessarily invalid, because experiences and opinions are those people's, it's like, well, Scientologists think this. Scientologists think this. This is all their opinions of what Scientology is. Scientology makes you think this. Well, Scientology is just a bunch of data. So it's like you have your own determinism and your own opinion. Who cares what the press says? Who cares, what I'm saying? It's your own viewpoint. You have to make up your own viewpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of low-tone people tend to come across it and, like other things they would do in their life, complain about it and say, where did you get up to? What level?
I did fully completed OT3. Um, as far as the big side, I never did the knots or med for OTs, and frankly, wasn't that interested in it because the whole grade chart had sort of changed. And the reason I didn't do it was not because I didn't want to do it, is because, it was not made available to me. Had it been made available to me, I would have done it. More than likely.
And nowadays you wouldn't call yourself a Scientologist?
Oh, definitely. Well, it depends how you define it. Now, well, the first answer would be no. But if you take the definition of Scientology as it was defined in 1968 when they had this abridged Scientology dictionary, and it said a Scientologist was anybody that used Scientology in their life.
Yeah.
So if I was to take one piece of information, one administrative principle, because I run a business, yeah, I can say, well, then by that definition, not only me, but even ex-Scientologists could be considered a Scientologist, which I'm definitely an ex-Scientologist. By the current definition, Scientologist is the way the church defined it, is only somebody who is on lines in good standing is a Scientologist. There's also something called an independent Scientologist. I'm not an independent Scientologist because I'm not, practicing or advocating independent Scientology. I'm not against it, but it's not something that I do.
Would you call yourself a fan of LIH?
A fan? I was a fan, but I've sort of outgrown my fandom. I was a devotee of LRH. He was a big part of my life, and I'm very grateful that I experienced him. I learned a lot from him. I'm actually now a practitioner for the last 10 years of Taoist Qigong. And I would tell you that one of LRH's biggest flaws as a human being was his lack of breath. He did not know how to breathe. Now, this can be said of all human beings, but human beings breathe with about 5% of their lung capacity. And all of your lungs feed your internal organs. You have 5 different lobes, and they feed the internal organs. And so LRH had breathing problems. First thing I learned when I got to the ship was that we were in warm waters. We stayed in warm climates because he had a physical condition. Now, when you mentioned juicy letters, well, one time I received a letter from his medical officer, and I don't know, I think a doctor had sent a letter back that he'd received from her, and it was Kima, it was his medical officer, and basically stating that he had pleurisy, which is a lung disease. In other words, he smoked a lot, and he did not have good lungs. He always had problems with his lungs since I had been involved with him. And I remember one of my colleagues saying, "Don't you know LRH's medical condition is confidential?" I said, "Nobody ever told me it was confidential." Because it was common knowledge on the ship. So basically, when you don't breathe with all your lungs, you're not using your full brain capacity. Now, while he was using brain capacity that was far in excess of the normal human being, he could have, breath represents life, and he was missing out. LRH did not like being on Earth. He did not like being in a body. If you read his writings, you see he had a contempt for this physical universe, so to speak. And what I have learned in my own life is Well, this life is certainly challenging. From a Taoist perspective, you consider life to be extremely valuable. And if you're given an opportunity to live, you live it to the fullest. Because they will make the argument that there's lots of beings out there that want to incarnate and have this life. Life, you know, it's considered a privilege and an honor to be able to have a life. That's a Taoist perspective. And certainly, when I was in Scientology, I was very happy and ready to check out when the time came. Now I have a completely different perspective that I will have an extremely long life. I have been given gateways to suggest that I can have an extremely long life. So it's a different perspective. So I'm not following that mindset anymore.
Yeah, it sounds like you EP'd Scientology.
Well, yeah, but I would also tell you something. I had a very remarkable experience because I had and I will share this because we're kind of hitting our time max here, but one of the most challenging experiences in my life was after I became successful as a writer and publisher. My marriage dissolved. I had a lot of serious, my ex-wife had a lot of issues, and it kind of really it was a very devastating experience. Not so much the idea of losing my wife. that wasn't so bad. The problem is it kind of left me in a financial pit, so to speak, and picking up the pieces, because I still had to, provide for my daughter, provide for myself, and provide for my ex-wife. So where I had gone into I was in a very good affluence condition. I went into, some lower condition. So basically, after, and then when I got divorced, I kept waiting for the next situation to manifest. Okay, but what's this? And nothing manifested. After 4 years of not having a new, wife or relationship, so to speak, I began to realize that I was very happy with myself. I'd always been happy with myself. Marriage, you can kind of lose yourself in. But I think that was the result. And I don't remember the date that happened. But it was one of the few times I picked up an e-meter and I began to process myself. And I did my own director of processing interview. I basically did a suppressed person rundown on myself. And the suppressed person was not my ex-wife. She was not the SP, so to speak. There was another person who was involved with a lot of dark stuff. And I did this, and instead of having the standard EP, which is, I think, is the suppressed person, the person who was suppressing you is supposed to write to you, I got something out of the dream world. Okay?
Yeah.
And this is a really remarkable experience. The dream world was this, I dreamt of this woman that I knew. And I would have classified her as the most beautiful woman that I knew. And I had a dream within a dream about her. Dream within a dream. And I said, this is really interesting. So I said, the dream was, that was the end of the auditing. That was the end of the process. I said, what is this? But anyway, I was a little lazy to call her because she was more of a casual friend than a close friend, and I hadn't seen her in years. And I called her, and she says, you should have called me last week. I just got engaged yesterday. It was Valentine. I called her the day after Valentine's Day. And she said, you should have called me last week. And then we talked for a while because I told her about the dream, and she says, let's get together. And so we made an agreement to meet at a Starbucks. It was such a bad weather, windy day that, she called it off. We never got together. It would turn out that this dream would have great significance, even though she was not to be my partner. She represented, in my own mind, the most beautiful woman I'd ever known. And here she was, she was friendly with me. A psychic friend of mine once told me, she says, your next girlfriend has to do with a laundromat. So I went into a few laundromats and didn't work. And this is ridiculous. And then I later saw this same woman years later in a grocery store, and she was looking at a laundry advertisement. And I went and looked at it. They were selling discounted detergent, and I looked and I recognized her. She didn't look the same. She'd aged quite a bit. And I said, "Oh, hi. How's your marriage working? Oh, yeah, it's working out good. It's okay. It helps to have somebody to pay the bills," she says. And anyway, that was that. But later on, and it only happened about 3 years ago, I would meet this woman at a sacred site in Romania, Transylvania to be specific, where I go every year. That's a whole other part of my life. And I met this beautiful young woman, and let me just say, the indigenous spirits of that area are known as the Solomonare. King Solomon is named after the Solomonare. And her name was related to Solomon, the girl that I had the dream with. So she was kind of like an agent of spinning. The dream state was tying me to my future, which is now my wife. I'm now married to a, young Romanian woman she'll be 29 next week. I'm 64. And it's a very, so in other words, that auditing process, although it took me, I got the EP, and ended the process, it took, over 10 years to kick in.
Exciting for, yeah. I noticed that a bit with you get these delayed wins.
Yeah, it was all valid, in other words, but it just, time does not happen in the way necessarily. It is outside of time, but I would validate the Scientology processing that I did, although it was not necessarily a rote win that I got, but it tied, the dream state. Dreaming is very important. Scientologists don't necessarily acknowledge dreaming a lot, but I've had a lot of remarkable success and wins with dreaming.
Yes, and we're going to sort of wrap things up. So I just want to say, what sort of personality, quickly, what sort of personality did LIH have?
What sort of personality?
Yeah.
Well, the book I'm working on now is evaluating him by power. Power, it's all about power. And I would say he exhibited power. He could be extremely friendly, and if you appreciated his work, and I got along splendidly with him karmically. My karma with LRH is very clean and very good. So I did not come a cropper, as you will, by reason of my association with him. I benefited greatly. And if you appreciated him and his work, you could interface with him. If you didn't, then you could have problems. So I think he was all of the things that people said he was, and that's the positive and the negative. Some people experienced him negatively. I didn't have that misfortune. So, it's A, B, C through Z. For he is what he is to you, as he would say. What's that word he said about if it's true for you, it's true. And we went off in a very personal direction tonight, which I'm not used to, but it's okay. I'm usually used to talking about my work, but this is fine.
Yeah, and can we wrap up this mission holder, because you're talking about this mission holders conference, and we're talking about back in 1982. Can we somehow wrap up what was the conclusion of all that?
Yes, yes. See, the problem with Scientology as a movement, Scientology, Hubbard said that, there's something called cultural lag. It takes 20 or 30 years to catch on. Well, Dianetics started in 1950. Here it was 1980, 1981, 1982. It was 30 years later. Scientology had caught on. It was ready to go mainstream. All that had to happen was that L. Ron Hubbard himself or his top agents had to plant a flag and declare victory. And by not declaring victory, they never had victory. They began to look at, all of the people that would accept them as enemies. And I will tell you this, that when my wife at that time, when we got married, we needed a place to live because they'd run out of birthing spaces. So they were eventually going to get us an apartment. But until they did, she says, I can get a place at my friend's house. She's a public Scientologist at the land base. And so we could live off base, which we're going to live off base anyway. And we were told, no, we don't want to be infiltrated by the enemy. They considered their own public the enemy. This is what Scientology thought of their own public as the enemy. That's how crazy things had become. This was the internal lingo that was being used. And of course, I thought it was abhorrent. This woman wasn't their enemy. She later became their enemy. But that's because they acted the way they acted. So basically, all his LRH or Scientology itself, it didn't need LRH to do it, just needed to declare victory. And at that point, Scientology would have been a happy household word that people could have used for their own benefit. Instead, it became what it is today. And you have, go ahead.
Well, do you think there was it at this point where sort of David Miscavige took it over and went downhill?
Oh, totally. He ruined it. He ruined it. Now, to what degree Hubbard was involved in the ruination, I can't say. That's still obscure. He had something to do with it because of what he was being fed. He had something to do with it, but as he would say, your information is what information you get will affect things. But it was ruined as a dynamic movement. It was ruined, completely ruined, at least. And see, there's one reason the independent movement cannot do what the church movement could do. And I will be very brief, is that in Scientology auditing, you would say, well, it has 100% workable technology. Well, it does if it works. There's a certain percentage of cases that work well or very well. There's another percentage that don't work so well, and you have to use qualifications, cramming, and all the techniques of qualifications to correct these cases. Some of them correct well, some of them don't. It takes more precise expertise on the part of the practitioner. There's another percentage of these cases that get shunted off into what would be called not just ethics, but guardian's office, or now OSA. These are cases that are just abhorrent, that aren't going to work, or whatever. So because pre-clears could never talk about their auditing, you could never talk about their auditing because that was considered against the rules. The reason for that is, first off, there's two reasons. One is you don't need to be judging yourself by what other people do. The other reason is that when you have everybody shut up, you don't hear the bad news.
Yeah.
And the bad news. Now, so when you go out into the independent field, this person, persons, if they don't get a good result from Auditor A or Group A from Ron's org, they'll go over to independent org auditor here. They'll go over to free zone person here. And basically, they will go over and they will basically discredit all of them. And they will give bad reports about this person, and there is no unified whole to make them shut up. because they can't be made to shut up because they're no longer, soul is no longer bound to the Church of Scientology. In the free zone, you're not bound to anybody. So there will always be an element of what you call negative PR that will go with the free zone because they have no hold. They don't have the hold, the clamp down control that the church had. And this was both a good and a bad thing from that perspective. So this will make the free zone ever susceptible to and vulnerable to attacks. Attacks, perhaps they're justified, perhaps they're not. But it's not going to be able to hold up the image where, the person signs their life away, signs away their credibility. So this is an inherent problem with the free zone, whereas Scientology as a church clamp down and suppress any dissension. The free zone cannot do that. And if it operates impeccably beyond belief, which is too much to ask of human beings, then it could conceivably have a chance for doing something. But I don't think it could ever match what Scientology did in its heyday.
Yeah, well, we'll see. And what do you think of the theory that like the FBI or IRS took over the church?
Well, the IRS obviously didn't take over the church because, if after it took over the church was the IRS still didn't declare it, tax free. That happened much later, after supposedly, But Mead Emery was the person who reincorporated, drew up the incorporations for the Church of Scientology, the Church of Spiritual Technology. Mead Emery was involved when Scientology was being raided. He has a conflict of interest. Also, I would tell you that the special board of directors of the Church of Spiritual Technology, if one of them, these special directors are appointed for life, they're attorneys. And if one of them dies, they have to be approved. The replacement has to be approved by the California State Bar Association. Now, if I don't know to what degree most of your audience is in Australia, but in America, we have something called separation of church and state. Because this is a church, it completely violates the principles of church and state for the California State Bar Association, which belongs to the California Supreme Court, to have any say over a church. So right there, you have an inconsistency within the, why is the corporate structure of the Church of Scientology or the Church of Spiritual Technology, what the hell does it have to do with the California State Supreme Court? It should have nothing to do with it. But this is the way the structure is set up. So there is, in the structure, there are illicit associations with government structures. You said IRS, and who took over? Who else?
FBI, maybe.
What's more relevant than the FBI taking over, which just doesn't, really make any sense, is that the FBI, all the documents that they seized in the raid of the Church of Scientology in 1977 in both DC and LA, part of the information they seized was the information that the Church of Scientology had on them. Not so much the FBI per se, it might have included the FBI, but on the drug running the CIA was doing in the Golden Triangle, in the areas of Southeast Asia. And this was a big investigation that was being done by the Guardian's office. So this information has never surfaced. The people from the Guardian's office who knew that information have never come forth with it. What did we have? And this would have come forth in the trial against Mary Sue Hubbard, but it wasn't brought to trial.
Yeah. Look, just to clear things up for the audience, what Peter's talking about is the fact that corrupt elements of the U.S. government were bringing drugs into America, and this is how corrupt the world is that we live in.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a whole. The the elites have supported themselves with the drug trade going back to the British Empire. And of course, the United States, the CIA, the Flying Tigers, the Golden Triangle. You can look, all this stuff's online now. But back then, it wasn't online. There was no line for it to be on. And the Guardian's office was investigating the corruption of the United States government and the CIA in particular, not necessarily the FBI per se. But so this was one of the reasons the government needed to quell the Church of Scientology. So that is a is definitely so. They didn't so much take over the Church of Scientology, but they neutered it. They neutered it or helped neuter it, and made it. But even with all that, and the Mary Sue going to jail, it didn't have. Scientology could have gone on fine. That wasn't the problem. The problem was David Miscavige and his involvement. Far and away, it ruined it. And we can only speculate as to what, his involvement is with anybody other than the obvious. The one thing I would say about him, the one area that's not been picked up is his interfacing and relationship with attorneys that began to take place years before he took over the legal reins. He was negotiating, talking to attorneys that helped him design how to get Pat Broker out of the way, because they basically, he either asked them or they taught him in one way or another that he had to get goods on Pat Broker, which was to get signed documents saying that that Pat Broker had received so much money. And then they said, well, he had to account for it. And then they basically threatened to put Pat in jail after setting him up for that. So Pat was neutered from doing anything. But somebody coached Miscavige on that. So we don't know exactly which attorneys that he interfaced with. We can assume who they are and that they were involved, but we don't know this. And this is something that would unravel a lot of the mysteries concerning David Miscavige and associated alliances like you suggest. I don't, wouldn't blame the FBI or the IRS per se. Exactly.
This is a little bit off topic, but this is something that you know about. That's mind control. Do you think Scientology processing produces a person that cannot be easily mind controlled?
Oh God, it depends. I mean, many Scientologists appear to be very mind controlled. What I would say is that Scientology, which means knowing how to know, was originally designed to take people out of mind control. But people on Earth are generally considered to be under mind control, just from growing up into Earth and living in the society. So when you begin to, try and stir up the hornet's nest, the king hornet might come out and stab you or sting you. So it's like, the Scientologist has to come out of, the phenomena of mind control. He has to grow out of it. He has to grow out of it because he goes there. The only reason he goes into Scientology is because he considers that he has suffered mind control.
Yeah.
Or just have full possession of his mind. So he goes in there in an attempt, and what he negotiates, it's like you give somebody a knife and they go into the jungle and they come out cut up. they met something that was bigger than they were. Um, so, it's Scientology can produce wonderful things. I've seen it. I've experienced it. When it's not done intelligently, it produces the opposite. It has the power to uh, help or hinder, just like a knife.
Yep. And this is totally off topic, but what's the deal with Aleister Crowley? Like, do you think he's evil?
Aleister Crowley was somebody who defined himself as the Beast 666. So, you know, uh, he embraced evil. He embraced evil and he took it on as a, characteristic facade. And the deeper you study him, you might find that he did it in order to transcend it. He accepted it. But that's and I would also tell you from my personal experience that most people who study Aleister Crowley become possessed on some level or not. I have witnessed this very frequently, and many times they begin thinking they're Aleister Crowley. They identify with some crazy aspect of their own persona, or they take on another persona. So it's a very loaded subject. Was he evil? He was more than evil. He was a human being who identified with evil, but he also played with it. He was a master game player and craftsman. So to just think of him as evil is kind of dismissive of who and what he actually was. If you read his autobiography, you'll see that he, had very human characteristics, and but he was an eccentric, and he was frankly quite off the beaten track.
He sounds quite like a complex person,
to say the least.
Yeah. So this book you're saying you're writing, when do you think this will get released?
Gosh, I don't know. I would give myself a year. I'm not in a hurry. And I don't know which way it will go. It will likely be followed by another book called The Occult Biography of L. Ron Hubbard, which will go deep into, the sort of the genetic anomalies associated with this very strange man, very unusual man, and a man I'm very happy that I had what limited interaction I did with him. So, as they say, as I study Qigong, Qigong means breath work, but in Qigong we say slower is better. There's no hurry. The other thing I would say is that, Scientology promised you to be clear in 6 months. In its initial days, you can go clear in 6 months, you can do this, and you can have incredible experiences within 6 months. I certainly did. Some of the most incredible experiences of my life within 6 months of Scientology, and even more so after a year. But what I would say is that we're dealing with eternity, and we don't have to be in a hurry. We have all of eternity to accomplish things, and this is a perspective that things have to be done now, have to be done quick. It's the idea of the tortoise versus the hare. Scientology as a movement had a lot of hare in it. I'm talking Hare, the story of the tortoise and the hare. The tortoise goes slow, steady, and we don't have to be in a hurry for David Miscavige to fall from grace for whatever it is. And I would also say that LRH used to say in public relations surveys, he'd say that people don't like, I remember he told Chick Corea, he says, people don't like, he wrote this in a letter to him, Chick's group was called Return to Forever. He says, people don't like forever. They don't like eternity. In surveys, don't mention these things. They don't like it. They don't like to be mentioned. However, uh, we are in eternity, whether we like it or not. And this is just a perspective. So it's I would advise people to learn how to breathe deeply and to relax. And whatever you're going to do, whether it be independent Scientology, not independent Scientology, is be in the present time. It's a present. And this is where all of the power is, in the present. Not in the future, not in the past, but in the now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I haven't gotten any benefit from rushing anything. I've found it's the quickest way to key someone in is to make them do something in a hurry. It's terrible. All right. So, if somebody's new to your stuff, hasn't read any of your books, what would you recommend is the first thing they should check out?
Well, I have the website timetraveleducationcenter.com. You can go on that website. There's 3 videos, 3 little boxes to the right of the main video. Go to the bottom one. There's a video on the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. That's a 5-minute video that introduces you to the work I've covered. The first book that I've published and wrote, I was the ghostwriter for the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, which is about time experiments. This talk about, what is it, matter, controlling matter, energy, space, and time. Well, this is the time part. That there was a lot of stuff going on that, certainly an implant station on the eastern end of Long Island. Yes, during the 1970s. So anyway, that's where one can begin. There's a lot of interviews I've done on YouTube, and you can listen to Peter Moon all day if you have the time or inclination by just going to YouTube. Peter Moon, Montauk. I've talked about all sorts of different subjects. A lot of my recent work has been in Romania and Transylvania, which is a whole nother story. It's not about Dracula either, but in any case.
Yeah, it's all extremely interesting. And the final last question. So what you're saying is that time travel definitely is possible, literally in like you hop into a machine or you walk through something and you actually go to another time and then you can come back.
Well, let's say with those videos, and the first 7 videos are, you just have to click in. They're free. They basically will show you the math and physics that demonstrate that time travel is within the bounds of ordinary math and physics. Very simple. Now, I happen to have a friend who's followed my work, who's very interested in my work in Scientology, by the way, Dr. David Anderson, who has built a time reactor. And if people subscribe to the website, they'll see a patent application for the time reactor, which gives the details. In addition to that, another video which explains the time reactor. I will be releasing the time reactor patent soon. I also gave it to the History Channel. I did an interview with the History Channel a couple of weeks ago. They came to Long Island and drove me out to Montauk, where I did an interview with them. They'll be doing a whole show on the Montauk, Secrets of Montauk, it's called.
Oh, that's going to be good.
Well, we'll see what they do. But in any case, I gave them the opportunity. I gave them the patent. They're welcome to show it. Now, the reason it's not public, and it could be because every time I used to put it onto my website, digitalmontauk.com, that's another website, it would be removed. So I published it in a book called The White Bat, which is my most recently published book. It's about my adventures in Transylvania. So anyway, I got a little frustrated. So I published it in that book. So it's now recorded in the Library of Congress. I have kept it on my website, but it's only available to people who pay and they can watch it on video. I haven't released the PDF of it. Now, there's other people that have that PDF. There's 4 or 5. They're not really in a position to circulate. They could if they wanted to. But it's time for this to be released to the public. It's just a patent, and most people probably won't understand it. I went into laborious detail to describe it to people as simply as I could in the videos. Not, you know, not in the free videos, but in the, because I had to have some incentive for people to sign up to my subscriber website. But I will release a PDF of the patent application. And the patent, by the way, has been sequestered because it's so of such vital interest to the defense of the United States. That's a whole other subject that we really didn't get into. It's more of what I'm involved in. When I talk to you about all this Scientology stuff, this is, I'm dredging stuff out of my past. I'm rather pleased at the amount of detail I could provide for you. I hope it, is down the alley of what your audience wants to hear. Scientology is a foundational component of everything that I've done. And I don't begrudge anybody their experiences with it, whether it's been good or it's bad for them. So I've had, it's just been a wonderful trip. And there's a lot of things about L. Ron Hubbard that are just not understood. He's been portrayed as a horrible villain. He's been portrayed as a worse villain than Aleister Crowley.
Exactly, and he's not.
Yeah. Well, is what he left behind is certainly a lot more useful than what Crowley left behind, at least for the average person. But there are different aspects. But his, there's a lot more, and perhaps as these things come out in the future, we could have some other dialogues. Anyway, I wish you the best. I never really asked you too much about what you're doing, but I wish you the best with whatever it is.
Yeah, well, it's promoting the independent movement and putting the truth out there. And this book you're writing, it'll be more of a showing the positive side of L. Ron Hubbard. Yeah.
No, it's not to show the positive side. It's called the Tao of Insanity. Now, one of the things is, and I say it in the book, if you're around Scientology, insanity, you hear the word insanity more than you've ever heard it in your life. It was a frequently used word. If you're dealing with insanity, the implication is maybe people will think, L. Ron Hubbard is insane. Well, I'm not really saying he's insane, but we're dealing with a subject of insanity. And basically, I didn't mention this. I should have mentioned it. It's dealing with the occult matrix beneath Scientology. I just said that the Scientology is a foundation for everything of what I've done. Well, there's also an occult matrix beneath Scientology that L. Ron Hubbard is tied to that people don't necessarily see or appreciate. So this book has to do with the occult matrix beneath Scientology. And to get, more than whether saying he's good or bad, he was tied to this occult matrix. And, that's really what the book is about, is to understand more foundational components of what he was involved with.
What's the definition of Tao?
Of Tao?
Yeah.
T-A-O is how you spell it. The first thing you learn about Tao, the Chinese will pronounce it Dao, like D-O-W, is that you can't define it. It's the undefinable. But because you can't define it, they define it as the way. The best definition I can give you is it's the fundamental principle underlying all of existence. It's the fundamental principle. And it manifests, everything comes from it. It is the true source of the universe. It is the source at the same time. It's the source without being the source. So it's indefinable, and it's the mystery of all mysteries.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it's going to be a great read. I'm going to go to your website and check out what you were talking about. You've also got digitalmontalk.com. It's got some great information on it, right?
Yes, and the books are either on Amazon or skybooks.usa.com. skybooks.usa.com.
All right, great. Well, thanks for being on the podcast, Peter. It was really good to speak to you.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, see you later. All right, so that was the interview with Peter Moon. I hope you liked it. I thought it was great. And to end off, there's something new I have here in my hands, something new, and it is a Scientology joke book. Now, when I saw this this joke book, I actually thought it was written by a Scientologist. I didn't look into it too much. I just thought it was written by a Scientologist, and it'll be Scientology sort of related jokes. And I bought it, and when it came in the mail, it ended up being jokes that were bagging Scientologists. So it wasn't even written by a Scientologist. It wasn't even written by an anti-Scientologist. It was just what they do is they use generic jokes that are bagging, a certain thing like the Irish or the Polish or whatever, and they just switch all the words to Scientologist. So that's what it is. It's kind of funny, and it's this small little book. It's by Mark Jeffrey Young. You can actually go to him and order books that like a book that has your friend's name on it, and then you give it to your friend as a gift, and it's like, the best ever books of jokes about John Smith, and it has a go at John Smith on every joke. But I thought to finish off every episode of the podcast, I'm going to read out a joke from this book, and this is the very first joke. Okay, don't get your hopes up. All right, you know how some of these joke book jokes can be. They're not like Hal Roach. All right. Why do people take an instant dislike to Scientologists? To save time later. So that's the joke. That's what you get. That's how the podcast is ending off. I hope you liked it. I didn't. I like the podcast though. Anyway, that's it for the podcast. It's time for you to climb back out of this rabbit hole, out of this wacky Scientology world. If you like this adventure, make sure you subscribe. Check out Andy and Ultra's YouTube channel. Anyway, until next time, take care of yourself and get up that bridge. See you later.